Hello everybody and welcome to this theory video that is looking at theme 2's economic growth topic. So this is 2.5 from the specification. The specification which we are covering is on the board here. So we're going to be looking at the causes of economic growth, how we measure output gaps across the economy. We're going to be looking at the business cycle and the impacts of economic growth on different economic agents. Right, just to get you warmed up, what I would like you to do, please, is to write down the answer to question 1. So use diagrams to explain the difference between actual and potential economic growth. If you can now hit pause, write down your answer. When you've done that, please hit play. Right, everyone, now this is hopefully what you've got down. Let's think first of all about the definitions of actual and potential economic growth. Now, actual economic growth is a physical increase in the output of the economy. So that means there's an increase in the real GDP. This is also known as short-run economic growth. So a physical increase in output is going to be actual economic growth. Potential economic growth is measured by an increase of the productive capacity of the economy. So that means that the LRAS will be moving outwards. This is also known as long-run economic growth, with the logic being that if you're going to increase your productive capacity, this is normally not something that you can do overnight. There's a time lag between implementing policies to promote potential economic growth and the impact of them. So what would happen with potential economic growth is the factor endowment of the economy would increase. So the quantity and quality of land, labour, capital and enterprise would mean the economy has now got a bigger capacity to produce goods and services. Now we can show these types of economic growth using diagrams. So the bottom left diagram shows actual economic growth using a production possibility frontier. So remember, the PPF measures the maximum number of goods and services an economy is capable of producing. What I'm doing, I'm assuming the economy is starting off at G1S1. So that would place the value of the GDP of the economy by adding up the goods produced and the services produced in the economy. It's worth noting at G1S1 that the economy is operating with spare capacity. So we're operating below the country's PPF curve. So that would mean that we've got unemployed resources across the economy. Now, normally, because of a growth in aggregate demand, there'll be a growth in output from G1S1 to G2S2. So the physical output of the economy is increased. So this would show actual economic growth. It's also worth noting that when output increases, we move closer to the PPF, and this would mean that unemployed resources would now start to become employed resources. So spare capacity is significantly fallen. We can also show this using ADAS diagrams. So the LRAS here, a classical one that I've drawn, is the potential of the economy. So that's the maximum possible output. That would be an efficient use of factors of production. The LRAS is the same here as the PPF curve in the previous diagram. It measures the potential output of the country. So really it's a ceiling on how big the economy can realistically get to. So what we would show here is, imagine we start off at P star Y1. So AD1 is equal to SRAS1. Again, we're operating below the potential of the economy. If we have something that causes AD to move outwards, so this could be higher consumption, more investment, more government spending, more exports and/or fewer imports, then AD would move outwards. That would show actual economic growth. We could also show it by SRAS moving outwards. If we have a reduction in business costs and SRAS moves outwards, it would mean that we would again experience actual economic growth. Now, potential economic growth, we would show the PPF moving outwards. So that would show an increase in the factor endowment of the country. And of course, we could show that by the LRAS curve also moving outwards. Right, what I would like you to do now, please, is to identify 5 possible causes of potential economic growth. Excuse me. So try and identify 5 reasons why a country's LRAS curve might shift outwards. So hit pause, write down your answers, And when you're ready, please hit play. Right, everyone, now if we're looking at potential economic growth, just remember what we're looking at is anything that causes an increase or an improvement in factors of production. Now, what I'm going to focus on in my explanation here is generally looking at capital and labour. These are two big ways of promoting an increase in potential economic growth. It is worth noting, though, that land and enterprise can also increase or improve. So when you think about land resources, if we're able to discover new land resources, so this could be new fossil fuel supplies or better ways of harvesting renewable energy, then that could create potential economic growth. Enterprise, if we're able to promote more business activity and more entrepreneurship, that's going to lead to more businesses investment and growing, and that would also create an outward shift in long run aggregate supply. But anyway, for the purpose of my slides, I'm now going to focus on capital and labour as being the main sources of potential economic growth. So if we focus on capital first of all, anything that leads to more firms investing in machinery, technology, so being innovative and creative, will create potential economic growth. Anything that leads to more infrastructure would also create potential economic growth in the economy. Because what this would do, it would increase our capacity to produce, and what it would also do is to lead to more productive improvements across the economy. Now, when firms invest into capital, it means they're upgrading machinery, they're upgrading their infrastructure. Well, that would clearly increase their capacity to produce, which means they've got a bigger factor endowment. It's worth remembering, though, that investment alone doesn't guarantee an increase in productive capacity. What we know is that firms every year have to pay for depreciation. So capital and other assets will depreciate in value as they get used. So computers, for example, they depreciate, they become lower value as time goes on. Machinery will lose its capacity to produce in the same way that a car will become worse over time if it's not maintained. So investment needs to cover not just the depreciation, but there needs to be money invested on top of depreciation. Okay, so if I think about my car, for example, it probably depreciates a few £100 every year, and that's because of natural wear and tear. So if I don't invest at least the depreciation value, it means that the productive capacity of my car has fallen. So when I invest into my car, I've got to cover not just the depreciation value, but make an investment above that if I'm going to upgrade my car. Well, businesses are the same. They must invest beyond the depreciation value if they're increasing their capital stock. Okay, so capital improvements over time is a key source of potential economic growth. It's giving workers more productive resources to work with, and this would therefore increase productivity and therefore the productive capacity of the economy. Right, when we think about labour then, what we're trying to do here is to either increase the number of workers in the economy or to improve the quality of labour. So if we think about improving the quality of labour first of all, we often talk about human capital, which is the stock of skills and expertise that workers have in the economy. Now, if we're able to invest into upgrading skills and education of workers, making workers fitter and healthy through better access to healthcare and housing, then ultimately workers become more productive, and that would lead to an outward shift in the LRAS curve. And what we could also do, though, is look at increasing the quantity of workers in the country. This could be done by promoting those that are economically inactive to enter the labour market, so by raising minimum wage rates or reducing benefit payments to non-workers. What we could also do is to look at inward migration. In other words, encourage people from across the world to come live and work in our economy. Now, what this can do, it can help fill skill gaps. Now, a skill gap could be where firms are trying to recruit workers into certain areas, but they can't find staff with appropriate skills. But if we can import them from abroad, it fills these skill gaps and it increases the productive capacity of our economy. We could also look here, there were some labour shortages. So there are certain professions where we struggle to, again, get people to work in those industries. A good example in the UK is farming. where many British people aren't prepared to complete that type of work. Well, again, bringing in migrant labour can fill those labour shortages and increase the productive capacity of the UK economy. Right, now another thing I'm going to talk about though, potential economic growth, is the benefit of international trade. Now, here's the idea. This is something we will look at in more detail in Theme 3. When our businesses are able to sell their goods internationally, it means they've got a bigger market for their goods and services. So you're not just having to sell to UK consumers, you can now sell those products internationally. Now, when you scale up production, there tends to be cost advantages. So when you expand output, you can generally produce individual goods and services at lower costs. Is the advantage of becoming bigger businesses. Now, when you scale up production, you've got more investment taking place, which could fuel a growth in the productive capacity, but also you tend to find that productivity improvements. Because what will happen is, as you scale up production, you find more efficient ways of producing output. And again, if you can raise output per worker, then it will increase the productive capacity of the economy. What potential economic growth also happens here, though, as well, when there's international trade, firms in your economy can import better capital from abroad. So they can buy the world's latest high-tech technology from different countries across the world. And again, that allows them to increase their factory endowment, but also their productivity as well. It's also worth noting, though, that export-led growth in its own right can create a better potential economic growth performance. If you're exporting more across the world, it means that firms have got more funds available to invest. But also, if our firms are having to compete more with firms from across the world, they've got to invest to find better, more productive ways of producing so they can lower prices. And again, that can support potential economic growth. Right, now in this diagram, we can show both types of economic growth. Now imagine we start off at P1 Y star or YFO. The economy is operating at its potential. Now, the only way the economy can experience any more actual economic growth is to make the LRES curve move outwards. So you can show the importance here of investing into upgrading the productive capacity of the economy. If we can encourage an outward shift in LRES, it creates more scope for more actual economic growth as well. So to allow a long-run growth in GDP, we've got to be promoting an outward shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve. And that is the only way in the long run we can keep on growing our economy. It's also worth noting, though, as well, that when you have a growth in aggregate demand, it can also support, with the logic being that when we have an increase in GDP, there are more funds available in businesses, in governments, to encourage improvements in labour and capital. Okay, so for example, if governments are generating more tax revenue from a growing economy, they've got more funds available to invest into better infrastructure, education and skills, which would promote better human capital improvements as well. Also, if firms are generating more profits because of economic growth, they're more likely to have the funds available to invest into capital. And they've got better animal spirits as well, ultimately, which will also incentivise more entrepreneurship and more investment to take place in search of even more profits to be generated. Right, you've got another pause question to think about now. Now we know what economic growth is and what causes it. What I would like you to focus on now, please, is identifying 5 benefits of growth, and then try and have a go at identifying 3 potential problems of economic growth. So again, if you can hit pause, and when you are ready with your answers, hit play, so you can compare what I think you should be saying against what you've written, please. Right, so you've got here some general benefits of economic growth. So remember, economists are trying to solve economic problems on limited wants and needs, but limited resources. Ultimately, it's about boosting living standards across the country or economic welfare. Now, the logic would be that if GDP is growing, there should ultimately be a reduction in poverty, with the rationale being that when economies grow, it means there's more jobs available for people to complete. Well, that means unemployment falls and people earn more money. People in low-paid work might also experience pay rises, which helps them escape poverty due to growing demand for workers. You tend to find as well there'll be a bigger tax base because you've got more high income earners paying more tax. You've got more businesses paying more taxes. There's more consumption. There's more VAT being generated. So when that tax base increases, the logic would be there's more funds available for the government to tackle poverty. So build more social housing, raise benefit payments to the lowest income households across the country, provide more education, healthcare to give people more opportunities. So that would help more people escape poverty. Clearly, we've got the second one, which links in with the first one. Economic growth means a growth in GDP per capita, which means people can ultimately buy more goods and services and meet more wants and needs. We said the government will generate more tax revenue, which means there's more funds available from the government to invest into human capital. But also, if workers are earning more money, they've got more funds available to educate themselves, pay for more education, gain more skills, and people have got more funds to send their kids to university, which can raise life chances. But that one also ties in with businesses. If firms are growing and expanding and profitable, then they're more likely to invest into the skills of their workers as well, which will upgrade the human capital of the country. And of course, that will boost productivity and incentivize an outward shift in long run aggregate supply. If firms are generating more profits because they're selling more output, they've got better animal spirits, more investment taking place. Well, again, that will create huge benefits for potential economic growth. We've got more jobs, so unemployment will fall. So the amount of government spending required on job seekers allowance will go down. Again, that would lead to more funds available for reducing national debt and investing back into merit goods and things that create lots of positive externalities. And then finally, look at the last one. Economies are growing. There's more funds available to invest into green technology. So, the more successful the government are doing and businesses are doing, the more likely they are to invest into things like wind power, electric cars, so things that might ultimately reduce the impacts of global warming. We do have to be careful, though. We're often going to be thinking about, with economic growth, what is being produced, how is it being produced, and for whom is it being produced. So when we think about that, then what's been produced? Economic growth is simply an increase in the output of the economy. It takes no account of what is being produced. So if the extra output is simply things that create negative externalities, then what's the point? It's got to be things that promote better living standards for people. When we think about how it's been produced, we've got to be careful about what's the impact on the environment. Are people being exploited to produce extra output? How's it impacting on people's lives if they're working longer hours to produce more output? And then finally, for whom has it been produced? Is that extra income being shared equally? You tend to find that with economic growth, the wealthy will benefit the most, first of all. They're the ones that are investing into businesses, generating more profits, higher dividend payments, etc. So that tends to lead to inequality growing. You do, however, have the trickle-down effect, which should mean in the long run, as these people generate higher incomes, higher profits, more wealth, then they're going to be spending more, creating more jobs for the low paid, and that will trickle down to the rest of society. So everyone will hopefully improve because of economic growth, but you do tend to find there might be a growing inequality gap. So, the growth in incomes of the richest people might grow more significantly than that of the poorest people. Right, what I'm doing here, I'm breaking it up into different economic agents. So if we think about household, first of all, which of course are the consumers and the workers, as economies grow, you've got more jobs, maybe even better jobs available, so incomes will start to grow. Now, what this will also do, it will allow people not just to consume more goods and services to meet more wants and needs, it will allow them to save more money as well. Saving is such an important thing, it gives people that safety net in case they lose their job in the future. It reduces the chance of people falling into debt. It allows people to invest into wealth like property and shares. It also allows people an increased opportunity to save for retirement, to invest into pension schemes. I've also put down, though, increased access to goods and services. You tend to find with economic growth, firms are investing into new, better products, and that could ultimately mean that people can buy a bigger basket of goods and services that are also of higher quality as well. and that could hopefully further improve living standards. For businesses, firms are driven by profit. So if you've got growing GDP, you've probably got firms experiencing growing demand for their goods and services. So that means their market grows, their share price will grow, their profitability will increase, dividend payments can increase, and it also means they've got more funds available to invest into capital and labour. But also, if profits are growing and prices are growing, they've got more incentive to invest into capital and labour to upgrade their capacity due to higher returns being available on those investments. Now, if we then think genuinely about the government, living standards and the economy, you've got some key benefits here. Now, the key benefit for the government will be if the economy is growing and more people are working, there's less need for welfare support for the unemployed or for low income earners. That means the governments can save all that money. But also there's more tax revenue coming in from more people working, more income tax, consumers spending more, which is more VAT, and firms generating higher profits, which will be more corporate taxes. Now, what this will clearly do is to improve government finances, and that will then allow the government to upgrade the public sector, invest into better healthcare, education, upgrade infrastructure, and this would lead to benefits for consumers and workers, but also firms as well. If they've got better infrastructure, then it makes them more productive. They can access better workers from further away, but also they can transport things around the country at lower costs due to quicker speeds. So there's some massive benefits of economic growth. Here are some of the costs in a bit more detail. Growth in output ultimately means there's more pollution being created. So you've got these negative externalities of economic growth. You've got increased waste from factories, waste from consumers buying goods and services. So you've got to question the sustainability of this. Look at the picture in the top right-hand corner. That's a product of economic growth. You've got more people flying on aeroplanes, more factories churning out cars. That's more pollution, more depletion of non-renewable resources. So this could lead to negative impacts on future generations. So it might support better growth today, better living standards today, but this could ultimately mean, horrific consequences for people in the future. We've also got to be thinking about though as well, that in the UK in particular, we have a high marginal propensity to import. So when we earn more money, a big slab of that money will go on buying foreign goods and services. Well, that could worsen our trade performance if we're importing more. Now, what makes this even worse as well, that when our economy grows, our firms have got less need to export when they've got a big domestic market for goods and services. And this will clearly lead to, exports potentially falling, especially if the growth is creating high inflation, which would reduce our international competitiveness. So if exports are falling and imports are increasing, then the UK's trade deficit might also increase. Okay, so what we might ask the question is at the bottom, can economic growth be too high? Have we got to potentially aim for lower economic growth to ensure that we're not protecting the environment, but we're also protecting our trade performance as well? Right, question 4. Again, if you can scribble down your answers to A, B, C and D. So now's a good time to hit pause, put down your answers, and when you're ready, please hit play. Right, everyone, you've got here the business cycle. So what we're measuring here is how real GDP changes over time. Now, please look at the top right-hand corner diagram, the potential economic growth line. This is measuring over time the LRAS curve moving outwards. So in the UK, this would generally be between, on average, 2 to 2.5% per year. Now, the logic would be that when the LRAS moves outwards, it allows for more actual economic growth. So what you genuinely find is that the economy will grow roughly in line with the growth in LRAS. So we call this the trend rate of economic growth. Now, the problem is the economy doesn't move in this nice straight line. We have what we call a boom-bust cycle. So we have periods of time where actual economic growth will exceed potential economic growth. That means the economy is growing beyond what the LRAS could suggest it should be, so high rates of economic growth. But then we also have periods of time when we experience drops in GDP. where actual growth falls below the trend rate of growth. Okay, so if we were to track the stages of the business cycle, look what we have. At the moment, the UK is in a recession. So we've got GDP that is falling. A recession would be at least 6 months of negative economic growth. Then the economy tends to bottom out in a trough, also known as a slump or a bust, when GDP is as low as it's going to go in effect, really. So this is the worst stage of the business cycle to be at in many ways. It's where unemployment will be at its highest, GDP per capita will be at its lowest. You tend to then get a stage of recovery where GDP growth starts to pick up, and then we head into a boom stage where that growth rate accelerates towards that peak. The economy will then slow down beyond the peak, where growth rates start to fall again, and that could lead to another recession. Right, okay, now the idea is, everyone, that when we operate beyond potential growth or the trend rate, the economy is experiencing a positive output gap. When GDP growth falls below the trend rate, then we've got a negative output gap. Okay, when we're in a positive output gap, you've got high demand, that leads to high inflation, high scarcity, high employment. When you're in a negative output gap, you've got the opposite. You've got potentially low employment, so high unemployment, high underemployment. You've probably got disinflation, maybe even the risk of deflation. So this is a little bit like the Phillips curve. Positive output gap, the biggest problem is high inflation. Negative output gap, the problem is unemployment is too high. Right. You've got here then what tends to happen at different stages of the business cycle. So if I think about where the UK is at the moment in a recession, you tend to find that in a recession, confidence is very, very low. And that means that firms are not likely to invest because they're worried about demand falling further. Households, if they can, will possibly try to reduce consumption to save more money for fear of unemployment or underemployment. So people are battering down the hatches, if you like, and preparing for bad times ahead. So low animal spirits and low consumer confidence. Unemployment will be starting to pick up. So because people are spending less and firms are investing less, firms might also be looking to reduce how many workers they need, so redundancy might start to increase. So unemployment will start to grow. Due to falling demand, growing unemployment, low confidence, you tend to find that inflation might start to become disinflation. So price levels will still grow, but at a very, very low rate. So we might now find that inflation is below the 2% target. Government spending on benefits. Well, because unemployment's increasing, the need for more government spending will be starting to increase. There might be extra government spending taking place to support higher rates of economic growth. Tax revenue will also be starting to fall because firms are performing less well. Households are more likely to be unemployed, so tax take will start to fall for the government. So running a bigger risk of a budget deficit creeping into the economy. Now, at the worst on the business cycle, the trough, these problems will become even worse. So confidence will be at an all-time low. So firms will generally not be investing. With depreciation, then you might find that gross investment is now negative. So the quality of capital might actually start to fall. That could ultimately reduce the productive capacity if firms start going bankrupt. Unemployment will reach high. So we've got massive redundancy, we've got massive numbers of people unemployed, underemployed, wage rates might be falling because of it. And because of all these problems, AD will be that low and falling that spare capacity will be so high. And this could mean that inflation becomes negative. So price levels might now actually start to fall due to low demand. And that could make confidence even worse and unemployment even higher as people delay buying things, waiting for price reductions. There is one little benefit to it though. Trade performance might start to improve, with the logic being that because there's such much low demand domestically, more of our firms look to export markets. If there's deflation, of course, our international competitors will increase, and that would mean that we could export more across the world. But also, falling demand for goods and services domestically will also reduce import demand. It's not very good for the government, though, With unemployment being at a record high, there's going to be lots of government spending taking place to support the unemployed, and tax revenue will of course be very, very low as well. So governments get a double whammy. Tax revenue will be falling, but there's a need for more benefits to be happening. Now, when we move from the worst of the business cycle, we enter a recovery stage. So the idea will now be, it's a bit like spring. We have a few shoots of growth. Confidence will start to improve, still very low, but it's starting to grow. And that could mean there's a bit more investment taking place. Consumers might start spending a little bit more money again. And then what this will create a growth in aggregate demand. So unemployment, although it's still high, will be starting to fall. And that will be promoting even more improvements in confidence, which might mean there's more consumption and more investment starting to happen. Inflation will still be low because there's so much spare capacity, but that as AD starts to increase, then inflation will hopefully start to grow again. And obviously, if more people are working, there's more spending taking place. Government finances should also start to improve. Then when we move towards the boom and the peak on the business cycle, this is the highest consumer confidence we're going to have, high consumption. Firms are going to be investing more because of higher profits. This high demand would mean there'll be high demand for workers, which means unemployment will be very, very low. All this, though, will create lots and lots of scarcity across the economy. Firms are struggling to keep up with demand due to a lack of spare capacity. This scarcity will bid up inflation rates across the country. Now, all this will be devastating for our trade performance. As we start to earn more money, we all start buying more imports again. But also, due to high inflation, foreign goods seem more attractively priced than domestic goods. And obviously as well, if we've got high inflation and we can't meet domestic demand, it means that we're going to be exporting less across the world as well. But also because of high inflation, export demand will naturally start to fall due to a reduction in our international competitiveness. So the trade deficit might start to get bigger. Government finance, though, should be very healthy. There's low need for benefit spending, and tax revenue will start to be really, really high. So what you can almost do, you can almost think about the 4 stages of the business cycle, a little bit like the seasons of the year. Recovery is like spring. We've got a few shoots of growth. Boom and peak, we've got high temperatures. It's the height of the year in many people's eyes. We then move into autumn when the leaves start to die in a downturn. And then we get the deepest, darkest winter, which is the trough, when we've got freezing temperatures, life is tough, and you've got snow, etc. And then, of course, the whole cycle will then start again. Excuse me. Right, now, just to sort of move towards the end then, you can see in these diagrams here how we can draw both negative and positive output gaps. Let's think about it first of all with production possibility frontiers. So in the first PPF under negative output gap, we can see all the negative output gaps is where output is below potential output. So we have a spare capacity in the economy. We have unemployed resources. So that means you've got a risk of disinflation, maybe even deflation, if that spare capacity gets too big. So look at the ADAS diagram associated with this. The output at P1Y1 is below the potential output. Positive output gap is the opposite. Look at the PPF diagram first of all. We're actually working at an unattainable output point. Now we do this by encouraging staff to work overtime, paying them higher rates of pay to work additional hours. So the idea is here we're working resources beyond their capacity. And that's the only way that firms can deal with labour shortages and high employment. So people are working beyond their capacity. That mass scarcity will create high inflation in the economy. If we show it using ADAS, we can simply see that Y1, P1 will be beyond the productive capacity of the LRAS curve. Now, what we're going to be looking at in the next video is how we tackle negative and positive output gaps. When you think about a negative output gap, we've got to raise AD, so make it move outwards to close off that negative output gap. That will mean on the PPF diagram, this cross, CO1, CA1, will move closer to the PPF curve. In a positive output gap, we've got to bring aggregate demand inwards to close off that positive output gap. So bring that cross on the PPF curve back in towards the PPF curve. This is going to be what we call demand side policies. So trying to manipulate aggregate demand to reduce the size of peaks and troughs on the business cycle. In other words, tackle negative and positive output gaps. Right, guys, now a really useful thing that you could now do is to end by looking at the specification again. Could you now go through all of these different parts on the spec and answer them all? If you can, your job's done. If you think you need to go back and look at them again, well, that's great. So look at the spec, highlight what you think you now need to work on, and use that as a way of improving your understanding of this topic. Right, guys, thank you very much.